Hello and welcome to this Women's Rights Network podcast. My name is Emma and I run the Children of Transitioners website. And today I am being interviewed by Olwen, who is also a child of a transitioner.
Right, hello.
Hello.
So we're going to have a conversation and take it in turns to listen to each other about our different experiences, different and similar, I'm sure they'll be. So today I am going to be asking Emma some questions to prompt her thoughts on what it's like to be the child of a transitioner. So Emma, what was your earliest childhood memory of your father?
I think it's quite difficult. When I was 5, we moved to Kent, and that's when I think most of my early memories are. And my memory of my father is that he was really funny and charming, and he was absolutely lovely. What I didn't realise, of course, was that he'd sort of alienated my mother a lot and was making sure that I wasn't in contact with my mother a great deal. So he really took up my whole life. You know, my father was my life. And we spent a huge amount of time together. And he was lovely. So, in my opinion, he was.
So when you say he alienated you from your mother, were you living separately from her? Were you living with him and not with her at the time, or were you all in the same household?
We were all in the same household, and obviously now as an adult I can look back and see the really odd things that were going on, which as a child you're completely, these seem normal, don't they? Because you don't know any different. So I had no idea what normal families were like.
No.
I just thought this was quite normal. But my mother often even ate separately. She was on a diet, so would often be preparing separate food and eat it separate to us. She was at work. She worked in Selfridges in central London. We lived in Kent. She had a long commute. It was a long day. She came back late and I barely saw her. And a lot of weekends I barely saw her. You know, she was working all the time, it seemed. So a lot of the time it was a bit of a treat if my mother was off. It's a bit of a treat to see my mother. And my mother was odd. You know, she had started sort of to have a schizophrenic breakdown.
Right.
So, which I think was prompted by my father's behaviour. It was a very intense and strange house that they were living in, quite claustrophobic, I think. And so I lived in the midst of that, not really understanding what was going on. Why did I barely see my parents? And the only person I really saw a lot of was my father.
Yes.
So, you know, they were both working. For example, from about 5 years old, I walked myself to school.
Wow.
I walked home to school. I sat in my house for a couple of hours before my dad came home.
Yes. And were there other adults in that household? You said it was chaotic. So it was just the three of you.
Yes.
And so that's a lot. That's a lot to deal with, isn't it? Without realizing at that age the things that are going on in the other life, in the parental life around you.
Yeah. So I remember I've quite a vivid memory of one night hearing quite a lot of shouting and going downstairs, and my mother was, hysterical, to use that word, and my dad slapping her. Right. I remember that really vividly. And now I looking back, you think, okay, what was going on at that point? You know, in this kind of very strange environment. You know, later I discovered that my father was dressing in women's clothes, dressing in my mother's clothes, and walking around the village where we lived in the evenings, So, you know, there were all those kinds of stresses and strains. He was apparently going to London, going to nightclubs, picking up partners.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing. And my mother was, having a very difficult time with that.
Yeah. So in those memories and kind of almost just school age, you were walking to school, you were coming home, you were a latchkey kid, I think it's called, isn't it, where you're kind of waiting for the adults to come home. And did you, when you witnessed that, what's really domestic violence, isn't it, or whatever, however complex that might be, did you feel, can you remember how you felt? Did you make an impression upon them because you'd witnessed it? Did you kind of walk out of the room? I'm just curious as to.
Yeah, I know. I was sitting on the stairs, and I kind of crept back into bed. I had no idea if they knew that I saw them. Right. I've no idea if they understood how much I was seeing, but what became, so when I think about my early life, because my father's transvestism was clearly obvious to neighbours, I absorbed, as one does as a child, a kind of sense and a feeling that was about things like our neighbours thinking that we were weird. And of course that impacts on you as a child. So we had next door neighbours, and their little boy was like my best friend. We used to play together constantly. And one summer they moved across the village. Now this is a new build village, so all the houses were identical.
Yeah.
They didn't go to a better house. They were all a few years old.
Yes.
They literally moved to get away from us, I think.
Yeah.
Saturday mornings, my dad was cross-dressing, and I wasn't allowed out of my room for a couple of hours. I had to just sit in my bedroom. And whatever happened, I wasn't allowed to open the door to my room.
Okay.
A next door neighbour had an accident. I think she severely cut her hand. And I remember seeing after it happened, she'd gone all the way around our house, even though we were in, to get help from somebody.
Yes.
So even in an emergency, she hadn't knocked on our door.
She hadn't knocked on your door. So you were a school child then, so there was a sense of us and them that you were already picking up or had picked up.
Mm. I think, transvestism, my father dressing as a woman, this is a curiously odd sexual thing to be doing. And therefore you're the weird family.
Yes.
You're the weird sexual family. And I think people, there's a way that people see you, but you don't know why.
We're talking now a good 20, 30 years ago. Is that right?
Oh, gosh, yeah. I mean, this was the 1970s. This was
the 1970s. Yeah. So
76, 77.
Yeah. And did it, I mean, as well as, so it resonates with me, that thing about things that are normal. We all of it, any child thinks that everybody's family is like their family, unless they have an experience of spending any time in another family, and that can be quite a shock as to either way, whether other families are bucking the trend or doing it differently. But from when you were in primary school, were other children in school, did it become clear or obvious to you in school that other people, was there direct, were you bullied from it? How did teachers react in a particular way? I mean, not that I know. I mean, I think examples of how now, as an adult looking back, you kind of remember them, avoiding your house in an emergency, moving across town to get.
Yeah, I mean, you go, of course, you look back, don't you, at your childhood, and you look for clues, right? And those, I think, were the clues. It's difficult for my mother to confirm things. They had adult experiences. I don't think these conversations were had in front of children. I just had this odd sense of something wrong.
Yeah.
And I remember as a child having these really weird dreams about my parents being monsters, like that they were secretly monsters and that they were hiding behind masks. These were recurring dreams that I had. about sort of finding them and seeing them take their masks off. So I don't know if that was something that I absorbed, but that I do have this real recollection of a sense of anxiety. You know, my father had deceived my mother into a marriage. The minute she got pregnant, he wouldn't touch her.
Right.
He said she was too fat, and she disgusted him. So, you know, her misery.
She's told you since, or was that?
Well, yeah, I didn't know at the time.
No,
you know, so I think.
Did you witness that kind of put down and alienation and sort of?
Well, I think I really witnessed the results of it, because my mother ate separately. She ate salads. That's all she had was salads all the time on her own, because for some reason we couldn't eat with her, because she had to prepare her salads and eat on her own. So I think there was a sort of sense of ostracization and bullying that my father was doing towards my mother, and a sense of me just ending up being quite separate from my mother.
Yes.
And I longed for her, as you do. So, you know, every now and then she'd be off and we'd spend like an afternoon together. And those were my best times, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I think you long for your mum.
Yeah.
You know.
And you described him as charming, and I'm getting the picture here of, so that this was covert alienation, as opposed to apart from those times where you heard shouting and, you know, witnessed abuse, but the charm alongside with that. So this wasn't a household of daily shouting, because your mother was absent from it quite a lot. So you got, was the attention that you got when you were together with your father a rewarding experience for you, or apart from being told to come out of your room at particular times? That's exactly looking after your needs.
But then when I was allowed out of my room, it was all treats. It was all lovely. You know, it was like we watched cartoons together. We had beans on toast and chocolate digestives, and we had this really nice time, and he was really funny, and we'd go out and we'd go, you know, for walks and all this kind of stuff. And it was just lovely. And he was so funny, and I loved him very much.
Yes.
And
that kind of leads to the next question, possibly, which is, clearly something changed. There was so this, you know, we could carry on, that might have carried on, and and that would be fine, but I'm guessing that it didn't, and therefore something may have happened, or that there was a further development in this in terms of the transition. Is that I was about 7 when I was home one day, my mother was home one day, and my father was at work. And this was a very rare coincidence. I think my mother must have just taken the day. Yeah.
And she says, "Would you like to visit my sister, your auntie?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, that sounds great." And we packed suitcases and we went.
Right.
And then we were living with her sister in Swansea, and she had quite a big house and she had lodgers. So we were her lodgers for a couple of years, or a year or so. Yes. And we were homeless effectively. So there were some times when my mum would row with her sister, or her sister would just chuck us out, and we'd have to live in bed and breakfasts. And we tried to get the council to house us, and they had these army barracks they were housing people in, and that wasn't very nice. So my mother was really trying to hold it together, but her mental health was not up to looking after a child and being the sole breadwinner and not really having any support from her family.
Yeah.
So I went to live with my grandparents, my dad's parents, for another couple of years, until my dad got custody, basically.
Okay.
Not legally. He just said, "Emma, do you want to come and live with me?" And I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great."
Yeah.
And that's when I went to live with him. He had, at that stage, when I was about 11, he came out to me and also to his parents as a transsexual.
Yeah.
And that was quite weird. So I was going to move in, which I did. I moved in with my transsexual father, just as he was starting taking hormones.
Right.
And then he got electrolysis and things like that. Yes. And the operation when I was about 15, I think.
Yeah. So let's just track back for a moment. That time when your mum and so when you and your mum went to live with her sister, did you see your dad in those couple of years? Did you have contact with him?
I think when I saw my grandparents, I think I did.
Yeah.
Not a great deal. I think he phoned me now and again.
Yeah.
It was that kind of thing. It was much more limited. And when I went to live with my grandparents, he did as well. In the meantime, my father had remarried. He married another woman.
Right.
In what I think was an attempt to get a stable place for me to live in.
Right. Yeah.
While he was having a breakdown. Yeah. And they divorced, and then he went to live on his own. And I was going to live with him.
So, so in that up until that point, he didn't dress in front of you when you were with your mum as a woman, no. But you became aware. You knew afterwards that he was doing that. Did his coming out to you and your grandparents come as totally out of the blue from your point of view in terms of going, that was not something I saw coming?
Yes, I mean, I was 11 and it was so bizarre. So he took me, my parents live in North Wales, he took me to Chester, and it was a really big day, and it was like going around the shops, it was really amazing. And then we went to have lunch, and it was great because we were eating out. I was not used to eating out. We never had any money with my mum. And he's kind of like, Emma, and then he kind of lays this out and he sort of says the cliches that, you know, we know now. I have a woman's brain and a man's body. I'm what they call a transsexual. I'm going to become a woman. You know, I want to be a woman. And, you know, what do you do? How do you react as a child to such? You just sort of take it in. You know, I was reading, there was an account in the papers yesterday of somebody coming out to his two sons who were like 6 and 8 or something, and they just say the dumbest stuff like, does this mean we can buy you necklaces for Christmas and things like that. You don't have a coherent thing to say. You're just kind of like, oh, okay, you know. And so that was my grandmother was extremely upset, and wrote lots of letters to my dad saying, could you try not to be a transsexual because it's going to ruin Emma's life. To which he kind of responded, well, I can't be anything else. You know, it was, I've got his letters, which are very, very dramatic. You know, it's like, I will die if I can't do this. And yeah, you know, and I loved him and I believed him when he said he was a, you know, woman in a man's body. Yeah. Yeah. So
you were living with him. He'd come out. Did he then start living as was? So there's in my own experience, you know, there's the transvestism of wearing women's clothing, and then there's treatment, and then in my case there was surgery afterwards. Different age group I was in at that point, but so you were ostensibly living with someone who was in transition with all of that going on, and in the house. And from that point when you moved in with him, was that you living with him as a woman?
That is, yes. So we were, as far as anybody knew, a mother and a daughter.
Okay.
Right. But obviously there were issues with passing, you know, so particularly early on in his transition, I remember us walking down the street and somebody shouting, that's a man, and my dad. I think there was nervousness about going to the toilet and things like that. And And I think actually having a girl with him was very useful for passing. I think, and it was certainly the case when his friends visited, as they did after a couple of years. He started getting quite a lot of friends visiting who were transsexuals. That if you think about it, if you're a man cross-dressing and you're walking down the street with a young girl, like teenager, it's such an unusual thing to be a transvestite and a teenager. People aren't really questioning it. You know, my experience of people looking is that often people, you have to be quite unusual for people to give you a second glance. Most people are just walking down the street and you just kind of, you're looking around and you're thinking, is this person a threat to me? Or do I have to pay attention to this person? And if you don't, if you think, oh, it's a woman and a daughter,
yeah,
you're not going to look. No. So I think that was quite helpful. I think I gave a kind of validation.
And what about you when you were walking down the street? Were you on edge? How did it feel?
I think I was on edge. And I think as well, because I would have said, I felt so protective of my dad.
Yeah.
I really did. And I think there was a tad brainwashed, really. You know, because I was in a sort of, I think I was in a state of trauma and I didn't really recognize it because I didn't think that there was any other way of being. But when I look back at it, I was on edge a lot. I developed a really severe eating disorder and I was a very, very miserable person to live with because I just cried a lot. Yeah, and what had happened to me was the dad that I had loved had effectively disappeared and been replaced by somebody who was very different and didn't really love me that much and didn't seem to like me that much. And I couldn't cope with it, you know. And I think when we talk about, you know, trans widows, talk about that, and people use the word grief a lot. And what I didn't realize was I was in this huge state of grief for what had happened, for my dream of my childhood, which had been, you know, because I'd been living homeless with my mother for a while. So I'd be like, life before this was so much better. And then my dad was like, that was a whole deception that I was doing. That wasn't real. That wasn't the real me. Once the deception was over, I was kind of like, what?
And in this period, so yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things going on, aren't there, in terms of you discovering who you are as a woman in your right, and also that being the only person from a family living, so that no third person in that household then, in terms of, and a relationship with your mother as well, that was, I mean, I don't want to, this is more about your relationship with your dad, but on the other hand, it's not, you know, there is that significant other person who is, well, I guess they were already divorced if your dad had married again.
Yeah, they had divorced, and my mum had a partner. Yeah. And I went to see my mum for like the whole summer holidays, and that was fine. Sometimes my mother was so heavily medicated, she slept almost the entire day. So there was this sense of a great deal of isolation, really. Yeah. Every relationship that I had with adults was difficult. My grandparents were quite difficult characters. Yeah. And, you know, my grandmother in particular was quite a difficult character. So everything, felt slightly hostile. Yeah.
And also a huge amount of two parents and you as the only child, who really weren't coping, and so you had to cope and support them. I wonder how prevalent that experience is for children of transitioners, where they're kind of the ones who become the protectors and the carers of people who are, not happy with themselves for whatever reason, and there you are meant to be gaining insight into being a happy person yourself.
Yeah, I mean, what you might call the Saffies, from Absolutely Fabulous, that sort of the very sensible daughters who, aren't taking all this mess, this rubbish. So there is a lot, I think, about what I noticed, and I noticed there was we can talk about it in another podcast as well, I think, is an employee of Stonewall produced a book for children, transitioners, about a childhood transitioners, called Nothing Ever Happens Here. And it's about a girl whose dad comes out as trans, and she basically becomes his emotional resource and his biggest ally and his defender, and she goes on the radio to defend him and all this kind of thing. And that was me. Absolutely, that was me. That if I couldn't care, I don't think I was even aware that you were supposed to care about your own feelings or have boundaries, or what I mean, that I was just basically, my father told me that if I didn't do exactly what he said, he wouldn't love me anymore.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that was the person that I was moving in with, and this was in the context of, there was a sex worker, a local trans sex worker who just moved into our flat, our 2-bedroom flat, and slept in the same room as my dad for months. And this person would just sit on the sofa and hated me. And when I sort of said, I'm not liking this, my dad would say, if you make any fuss at all, I won't love you anymore.
Oh my goodness. And what age at this point? What age was this, Emma? And where were you in your life, in your life journey?
I was about 14, and I have to say I was absolutely, I was really just living in books and films and an eating disorder. You know what I mean? That I was just trying not to be there. I was weird at school. I didn't have any kind of stability in my life. And I
How about, so did you have anybody you could confide in? What was what was making friendships like for you?
No, I didn't. I think later on, when I was about 15, I got a boyfriend who was really nice. I went into sixth form and I finally got some friends.
Yeah.
But I couldn't tell them. And that was another thing at school. I couldn't tell anyone in school that my dad was trans. My dad had been an education officer, so all the teachers knew that my dad was trans.
Right.
But I couldn't talk. I couldn't talk to any of the kids about it. When my dad went into for the operation, I remember saying, my mum's going in for an operation, I'm quite worried. And someone went, oh, is it a hysterectomy? My mum had that.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh yeah, it was that sort of thing. Yeah. Like, we couldn't have an exchange student. I couldn't have any school friends home.
No.
None of these things.
And you were calling, so you were saying my mum and my mother this and my mother that.
Well, what else? What else could I do? That these. And we hadn't actually discussed. I realised that my dad hadn't discussed this with me, what I was going to do. I was just ad-libbing all the way through. We hadn't really had proper discussions about it.
Yeah.
Even later on, like 5 years ago at my grandmother's funeral, people were asking who my dad was at this funeral. And I went, where is, because there's my dad's name, where is he? And I was like, oh, he can't make it a funeral, and this is one of his ex-wives. But my dad was there and said, oh, Emma will tell you. Why?
Gosh.
It was always, in a sense, for me to do this weird ad-libbing for my dad. I'm not entirely sure why he did that, but it was weird.
do you remember the first time that you did confide in another person? Did that happen in those teenage years, or was it much later?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think I went straight to uni at 18.
Yeah.
And I've been since then sort of on and off sharing. So sometimes I felt like sharing with friends, and sometimes it felt really awkward because you make a friend and then at some point you have to explain your pronouns and things like that. And it really, I have to say, it's only been, the last 7 years or so that I have really thought about my father in a more critical way, right? And said, okay, I'm not using pronouns, or, I'm not, that kind of thing. So I was like, people kind of go, where's your dad? Because I talk a lot about my mum, but tell me about your dad. And then there would be an awkward conversation, and I don't like lying. I don't like making things up.
No.
I've said, oh, I don't see my dad, which is true.
Yes.
Or I just kind of go, my dad's dead. I said that a couple of times, but that's really awkward because my dad's not dead.
No.
Metaphorically dead. I don't know, but so on and off I've confided in people, and the reaction has been confusion, I think, a lot of the time. I did get mockery from one person who has since become trans, so I don't know what that was about. But yeah,
mockery of your dad as opposed to
mockery of my dad, which I thought was really, really odd.
Yes.
But I think this is I think an interesting thing about child transition is who you tell, when you tell, why you tell, what you say. You go through life with it. You're going to get a partner. What do you say to your partner when they ask about your background?
Yeah. And in my case, what do you tell your kids when they're old enough to say, so hold on, Granny's our granny, and who's Lynn? Or rather, where's your dad? Who's your dad? Haha, well, that's an interesting. Okay, so yeah, we got some help with that. We can talk about that another time. So there you were. You went to university, and I guess that was a big move away from a situation that was not ideal for you.
Yeah, it had been intense and unpleasant, and I needed to not be there. My dad was not great at giving support, so effectively disappeared from my life. And I think one reason for that was he didn't want to give me any money. So I had to rely on other relatives. He did not help at all. I visited him for one Christmas, and then I wasn't kind of welcomed at any further ones. And our relationship really stopped for a long time. And then I think he phoned me up drunk on my 30th birthday, and we resumed, like he came and visited for a weekend. And then there were another few years where we didn't see one another. So, I do a website about this experience, but really the majority of that experience ended at 18.
Yeah. And I'm one thing listening to you describe that, sometimes this desire to change from male to female is to become a nicer person in the eyes of the transitioner, to shed the kind of what the stereotypes about being a man are, about being aggressive or hard or unemotional or restricted in some way, into being this softer, kinder, nicer, more supposedly rounded person. And yet this story goes from somebody being quite charming on the surface maybe, but actually nice to you as a child, kind of. I mean,
Yeah.
paying attention to you, taking you, and I know that there's a duality in that, and a kind of, maybe the treats and the nice times were compensation for the guilt that was felt for, which no doubt there is guilt up, and if there is a guilty secret, but then to turn into somebody who seems to have not transitioned into someone who became, for want of a better word, maternal, or kind of
I think
caring.
But what I think though is, when you look at this condition, autogynephilia, or however you want to talk about the rate, I don't know, the condition or the range of conditions that men have when they transition. One of the things that really, really strikes you a lot of the time is narcissism, right? And autogynephilia isn't of itself a romantic relationship with yourself. And sometimes that can be quite soft, can't it? It can be quite passive. And Lawrence talks about it being a romance with yourself, and you meet lots of transsexuals who seem very nice and but there's narcissism all the same, and I think my father spiraled into increasing narcissism. So I had cancer, I nearly died. My father wasn't even interested at all in how I was doing, zero interest at all. And I think that for a lot of, I think for children transitioners, your father is moving away from you and into himself.
Yeah.
And you have to learn how to cope with that sense of abandonment and that sense of grief.
Yeah.
You see it in other accounts of children transitioners, the sort of the way that you lose them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a very vivid description of what that's like, of that sort of distancing and in becoming into them, going into themselves. Whether the personality changes whether there's a personality change when someone transitions physically, and I think you just described the narcissism and a spiraling of narcissism, and you've shared quite a lot with us about some really painful memories, I guess, and of feeling a sense of loss and grief, and I don't know whether it'd be too much to say abandonment. And so the question I've got is, so you have some kind of residual relationship now.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether how you negotiated that, or whether you set boundaries in your relationship. Because I mean, we've spoken a few times. I've met you. You seem to me to have survived this, and you are a rounded, bright, intelligent, funny,
thank you very much,
and warm person, and that's my impression. With a great deal of insight actually into this, and so how have you negotiated any kind of relationship with your parent?
So what's really odd is my dad, when he talks to me, he seems to feel as if I've done something spectacularly wrong to him, and we're in touch despite this great hurt that I've done. I'm never really quite sure what it is, but it's, you know, there was a lot of emotional blackmail in our childhood. My grandmother was like this. They were always offended about something that you'd said or done. And somehow at some point in the last 30 odd years, I've said or done something. And that works really well for me, because what I realized is when someone is very upset and offended with you and they're not talking to you anymore, if you don't particularly want them to talk to you, this is great. And I advocate entirely. I've read this great book called Children of the Self-Absorbed, which I recommend to all children transitioners. And I'm sure there are lots of versions of having a narcissistic parent books and help groups and things like that. Grey rock, you know, just do a sort of bemused, you know, nothing, you know, like, so that I can't be engaged in a great deal of drama. You know, on my 50th birthday, he started texting me about all the problems he'd had with his mother. And I was just kind of texting back, oh dear, that's awful, you know. And he wants to do that, and I'm fine with that, you know. And I do have friends who are like, I don't know why you're in touch with him. And I don't know, it's really difficult. And I think one of the things that I've felt is that when my dad dies, I do want to be open to being for my dad, you know, at the end of his life and things like that. And, you know, and to maybe write a bit about that experience, I think will be really interesting. I don't hold out any kind of loyalty or love, but, you know, I this is still a relative and I don't have a lot of them, you know, so.
Yeah.
These, you know, these relationships are complicated. You know, I mean, all relationships with parents are in some ways. And then when your parent does something and is very self-absorbed, it is more complicated. And sometimes you have to remove yourself from them in some way. Yeah. Although, to be honest, I think my dad did that to me.
Yeah.
And my reaction has just been to not fall apart.
Absolutely. And there's a misunderstanding often, isn't there? You know, I'm not sure that, well, I wonder if this is the case. I'm not particularly bothered about how anybody else lives their life. What is disturbing is behavior, is how everybody treats each other and how they behave towards each other. And that there's a you know, nobody has to sacrifice themselves for other people, but there's a massive expectation. It's that autonomy and bending other people to your will and expecting people to behave towards you in a particular way, and then not necessarily behaving back in a way that takes notice of others. Very complex.
Very complicated. And I think there are a couple of things that happen. One is, I mentioned that my dad, he used to get these newsletters from the Beaumont Society, which anyone in the UK who's grown up with a trans parent decades ago will be probably familiar with the Beaumont Society. So the Beaumont Society existed for transvestites and was really about organising events for transvestites and making sure their wives were okay with it. There was a lot of pressure put on those wives. But they had this newsletter that was full of like frilly sissy fetish stuff, but also had some ads and some news for transsexuals. So my dad got that, and he got the Self-Help Association for Transsexuals newsletter through the Beaumont Society, Shaft, pun intended.
Yeah.
And through that, made friends with lots of different transsexuals, some local, like that sex worker I talked about, some and some who visited from other countries. Like there was this guy called Michelle who came from America and was really lovely. He was absolutely huge. He had like this square face. He was like a truck driver. He's this massive guy in the wig and the big specs and tons of makeup. And so I over time, I would say there were quite a few different transsexuals of that old school that I met, from who some were homosexual transsexuals, most were autogynephiles. A lot of them had children. A lot of them had partners.
And we don't use the word transvestite anymore. And to my mind, there was, well, when I entered into this world, you know, there was this big distinction then about transvestites, and the Beaumont Society was most definitely that. And then there was this, you know, doing something about it.
Yeah. And I know that trans activists have taken that apart, right? And it's now gone under an umbrella. And now you're not allowed to say transvestite, you're not allowed to say transsexual. All of that is not okay. But in some ways, from a sort of feminist woman gender critical perspective, is how much does it matter? Right? You know, I've read Blanchard, and I, you know, read where they're coming from and all this kind of stuff. But to be honest, what I can say from my experience is the focus on the clothes is the same, you know, and that desire to, I think a lot of transvestites are that old school. If you read the Beaumont Society, what they really wanted to do was be, you know, Michelle for an evening. And so there would be guys, and I think being masculine, being a man, felt very pressured. And so they'd dress up and they'd go to this club and they'd be Michelle. And the wives would always say he's much nicer.
Yeah.
You know, which I sometimes read as he's not violent. He's not nasty. He's
angry,
nice.
Sad, withdrawn, whatever.
All of those things. And those are transvestites. I think the transsexuals, what you notice now is the whole focus on that transsexual journey has gone. But what I saw from these guys, and many of them were really lovely people, they were very sweet to me, very nice, was I think they all saw women as emotional support humans and the people who did all the stuff they needed. You know what I mean? I think that they saw themselves as a special and better kind of woman, which I know Janice Raymond talks about in the Transsexual Empire. I think it's true. I do think they think that they're sort of woman 2.0. They're just doing it better, right? You know, we're not sexy enough. We're not wearing the right shoes. Yeah. We're a waste of femininity. You know what I mean? That we're not that. And they didn't treat women very well. Like they had wives and they didn't treat them well. My father married my mother knowing exactly what he wanted. He wanted a baby. He wanted a vulnerable woman who didn't have a big family, and he wanted to get a baby from her. And then he married a woman who'd just come into an inheritance, and he took all her money and divorced her.
So goodness. So tell me something, Emma, did he so after the transition, after he did he I mean, he took hormones, did he have surgery, did he go?
Absolutely, yeah. When I was 15 he had surgery, and there was a waiting list, so he got money from my grandparents for it.
Right.
It was quite a worrying thing. He was away for that, and it was scheduled over the summer holidays, so I was with my mum, you know, but then it kind of went wrong, and that his urethra started healing over.
Right.
And that was really upsetting. I think he had to have a second operation. I'm trying to remember the bits of that, because that was all quite distressing. And then it worked, you know, and I do have this really vivid memory though of these district nurses coming around. There were two of them. And the younger one, they kind of went into the bedroom when my dad was showing his operation. And the younger one came out, and she stood in our lounge. And I remember looking at her face, this poor woman, and she's just gone really pale. And she was like, "It's too weird. It's too weird. I can't cope with it. It's too weird."
So in terms of, so here's a man who had a wife and a child, and then a wife and a fortune. So did the relationship, so post operatively and now, this is not somebody who likes being on their own particularly, and does she have a partner now? And I'm constantly my nouns when I talk about my own father and experiences, but
I think my dad, so for some reason I'm not privy to a lot of the information about my dad's life he doesn't want to share. I think he had a male partner for quite a few years, who may have gotten ill and died. I'm not entirely sure what happened. I don't know. What I think is, when you sort of dig down to it, when you look at your father, what do they know about being a woman? What is that? Because we never made a connection in the way that I made connections with my mother, with other women, my aunts, my female relatives, my female friends. There was never that kind of connection that I made with my dad. And I love female company, more than anything. I love, just the company of women.
That's good. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting, what's fascinating about this conversation and other conversations that we've had previously with other people is the variety and the difference of experiences that as children of transitioners, and each story is quite different. So that notion of of the relationships that they have and the relationship that we have with them. And I'm determined that this is more this when we entered into having these conversations, it was more about our stories, that there are other places for their stories, but
that's true.
How their stories, or how their decisions impacted on us, and here we are as successful, articulate women. But I suppose the final question that I have for this conversation is, now that we're reflecting, and gosh, I'm hoping that we're going to both, it's plenty of food for thought, isn't it, hearing other people's stories. What strikes you about the lasting effect of that decision, or that condition, the family you were born into, the condition that existed for you, and what about the lasting effect on your life?
Well, I mean, what's lovely about, turning 50 is that you have this ability to have some perspective on it. I'm not right there in the middle of trauma, of the drama of being in my 20s and things like that. I can look back at these things, and my life is sorted. I'm quite happy with my life. But there was an article, it was, I think, in an American newspaper, and it was a woman who's getting married, and her dad is trans. And she's just got this feeling, as she's kind of thinking about making her vows and things like that, what if you betray me like my dad did? Not and in fact, she loves her dad, but it's kind of like, my mum had a wedding day just like this. What if it goes that wrong? And, it's funny because I know lots of children transitioners who, well, not lots and lots of them, well, and many of us, who have partners are really happy. I was never able to get over that. What if you turn? What if you change?
Lack of trust.
I can't predict it. It's the trust. I can't handle it. So I've never had, I had relationships, but never really able to maintain long-term relationships. And what I realized is I just don't trust them. I don't trust people. I trust friends. I have great friends. But there's always something in me with a romantic partner. I just can't trust them. So that, for me, has been a kind of lasting personal effect. The eating disorder has been with me my whole life because it was so intense when I was in my teens. And that's kind of, now it's fairly dormant. I don't have much of an issue with it. You know, it's like a little friend that I just carry around with me. But I you know, it's only kind of later that I've been able to say, yeah, I have some lasting problems that came out of that.
Yeah.
And you know, you look back and it's like, I don't hate my father. I used to practice little rants against my father, you know, like, yeah, you did this, you did that. And that went, you know, I don't really care about that. I did have a chance. Actually, when my grandfather died, I had a chance. I was on the phone and I kind of took a deep breath and started going, you've always let me down. You've always done this, blah, blah, blah. And then about 3 sentences in, I thought, what is the point? What is the point of you saying any of this, Emma? He's not listening. He's not interested. You know, anything you say further will just make him feel like a victim.
Yeah.
Just stop, you know, just hold it back, you know, that. And there's a lot that you let go, and a lot that what helped was seeing, actually, I think that this is a condition. And one thing that I found really interesting has been, initially I thought that my father was a very difficult person, was a narcissist, had all these issues, financial abuse, unreliable, mythomane, all of these things, and that who just happened to be trans. As I didn't know any other children transition, I wasn't that interested, to be honest, in revisiting that issue. I didn't watch Transparent or anything like that. I didn't want to know.
Yeah.
And then I sort of I realised there was this thing going on with transgenderism. Thought, how can I contribute? Started a website, and people got in touch, and I started reading more.
So this is Children of Transitioners, which
Children of Transitioners
is how we met. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm reading a bit, and then I realised that this is part of a condition. This is part of a series of behaviours that guys like this do quite often when they kind of blow up their family. You know, they try to pursue a very normal, very traditional life.
Yeah.
You know, with the wife and the kids, and then just break down.
Yeah.
And you know,
can't do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that sort of that, what I see is same patterns of behaviour. You know, the number of times I'm reading something or listening to somebody and I'm thinking, this is the same thing. This just happens again and again. And what I don't see, because the media is just an affirmation, and isn't this great? They're finding their authentic self, and they're finding their truth, and they're living their authentic truth, and all those kind of things. There's no help. Nobody steps in and says, you know, some psychotherapy, some antidepressants, some help could stop you
how to be
going
happy.
further down this path.
How to be happy with who you are. That's the holy grail, isn't it? I mean, that's the holy grail for all of us, is how does one be happy in one's own skin, whatever that skin is, and have a fulfilled life that way, without the need for catastrophic action around it.
Looking at clues of perspectives, one thing that I've really noticed about my dad has always been obsessed with how people see him. A kind of hypothetical stranger, people he doesn't know particularly well, how they see him. You know, he wants them to know that he's really successful and well off and attractive and incredible and things like that. And I've never felt that. I mean, I want the people that I love to love me and care about me, but I don't really care how I look to strangers. I look how I look. You know, I'm because I am just me. I don't have that worry that I have to kind of have any kind of facade that people need to see. You know, for me, the journey is inward. You know, it's about just trying to be a good person.
That's interesting too. Yeah.
I'm not interested in my appearance in that respect. You know, I think most of the world can expect from me is that I'm clean and I wear clothes. You know, and just, you know, the idea that people would get lots of messages from how I present myself is something he's obsessed with, and I don't really understand it.
That's interesting. I shall remember that. That's something that I need to remember for when you interview me.
Fantastic.
Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with me. I do appreciate it, and it's been very interesting, and I'm sure it's going to be of interest to other people. So, and I'm sure we could continue the conversation about different issues and with other people, or different issues around this issue, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.